In this video, we'll review an article authored by Professor Kenneth Kitchen entitled The Patriarchal Age, Myth or History. As you see here in the title slide, it came out in Biblical Archaeology Review in 1995. I commend this article to you. It's very interesting, very readable, and has some information that I think you'll find helpful as you consider the question of the historicity of the patriarchal age. A little bit of background concerning Professor Kitchen. He's a retired specialist in Egyptian studies. So by trade, he is a professor in Egyptology with a high degree of interest in biblical materials as well. He is a British scholar. First, it's worth introducing the terms minimalists and maximalists. And these describe individuals that kind of categorize scholars based on how they approach the biblical material. To what degree do they credit biblical material as being trustworthy for historical information? Those aligning with the minimalist viewpoint take a minimal amount of content in Scripture as being historically trustworthy. Now, they may say that there are spiritual truths that are trustworthy, but as far as particular events taking place in the realm of the patriarchs, particularly, they would be very, shall we say, cautious, very reticent to credit them with historical reliability. Maximalists are contrasting this, and they would say that as much as possible, they would like to trust the accounts of Scripture as having historical validity. Some of the figures who would align with the minimalist side, you see names listed on the left. Julius Wellhausen, probably most famous for his work on the documentary hypothesis, the theory regarding multiple sources contributing to the Pentateuch. More current scholars that would espouse minimalist view are Thomas Thompson, John Van Seters, and Donald Redford. As far as maximalists, and you can read the description there, but individuals that would that have aligned to this viewpoint: William Foxwell Albright, Cyrus Gordon, and the author of the current article, Kenneth Kitchen. Professor Kitchen will raise 7 topics in his article that for which he draws together information, and this will lead him to the conclusion that the patriarchal age, as presented, the information presented in the Hebrew Bible, has a high degree of trustworthiness from a historical vantage point. So let's walk through these 7 points one at a time. First of all, the price of slaves. From literary sources outside the Bible, we can chronicle the change in the price for which slaves were bought or sold in various eras. So the Akkad Empire, 24th, 22nd centuries BC. At that time, there are records that show that a slave could be purchased for between 10 to 15 silver shekels. Some 4 centuries later, early Babylonian, 19th and 18th centuries, the price went up to 20 shekels. Nuzi in Ugarit, about 4 to 5 centuries later, the price has gone up to 30 shekels. In Assyria of the 8th century, 50 to 60 shekels. And leading into the Persian Empire, 5th and 4th centuries, between 90 and 120 shekels. Periodically, the Hebrew Scriptures refer to the price of purchasing slaves. Please understand, we're not condoning this practice in any means. We're just comparing literary information over various eras. Thus, we understand that Joseph was sold by his brothers for 20 shekels. When we come to an excerpt in the Law Code, which, based on the dating contemporary with as it's reported, associated with the era of the Exodus, associated with the era of Moses. 30 shekels was the price that's reported there. The Israelite king Menachem in the 8th century will take steps to ransom some of his fellow citizens, Israelites, from Pul, king of Assyria. In order to do so, he remits 50 shekels per person. So this would amount to a slave price in that era. What's interesting is that when we find the period of extra-biblical history that most closely corresponds to the various slave prices attested in the Hebrew Bible, we find that the eras correlate with a remarkably faithful sequence. So Joseph, in fact, according to the biblical account, a good estimate would be that he operated in the 19th to 18th centuries, somewhere in that time frame. And the price for his enslavement, the profit gained by it, corresponds to the Babylonian price at that time. The time frame for the writing of the law code, according to the involvement of corresponding to Exodus and Moses' involvement there, the price that's given there, 30 shekels, corresponds to what we find in extra-biblical literature for cognate cultures of Nuzi and Ugarit, 30 shekels. And when King Menachem wanted to ransom some of his compatriots, the price he paid compares to what we see in Assyria of that same time period, the 8th century BC, 50 shekels, 50 to 60 shekels. This is the sort of pattern that we'll be following through the remainder of Professor Kitchen's articles. In other words, we are seeing parallels that fit with remarkable accuracy. We are not seeing extra-biblical evidence of a particular person, like naming of Joseph or something like that. We're just saying components such as the change, the transformation of economy matches what we know from extra-biblical evidence. Point number 2 in Professor Kitchen's article has to do with treaties and covenants. There's a great deal of detail that can be researched regarding this, but the salient point here is as follows. Treaties or covenants in the ancient world followed boilerplate components. There were some standard components. Notice those that are listed on the left. In Mari and Tel Leilan, component 1, deities serving as witnesses. Component 2, the presentation of certain oath curses, in other words, binding future outcomes on a person. And number 3, stipulations. What exactly was Party A and Party B going to contribute or act on as a result of their participation in the treaty? Those are boilerplate components. This is not an exhaustive list. We're just picking out some main pieces. That was the 1, 2, 3, the sequence in the early 2nd millennium, attested by materials excavated from Mari and Tel Leilan. Something like perhaps 500 years later, 400 or 500 years later, Hittite treaters, 15th century BC. The first element is the same, deities as witnesses, but notice that what used to be the third element, stipulations, now in the boilerplate sequence of Hittite treaties, the stipulations have moved up to second place, and oaths and curses and so forth, they follow that. This is the sort of component we're examining. Sequence of boilerplate elements. Later Hittite treaties will unfold with 7-fold elements, fairly complex. And now we want to take a look at what evidence we have for treaties in the biblical accounts. When we look at the Genesis treaties, we find that these correlate in the information we have in their sequencing. The boilerplate components correlate best to the Marienthal Leland material. And interestingly enough, the era reported in Genesis would correspond to early second millennium. In contrast, when we come to the Sinai covenant, we rather find something closer to the sevenfold Hittite treaties, the later Hittite treaties of the 14th and 13th centuries. And the Sinai material, also including some material from Joshua, it fits that era. So once again, components of treaties, particularly with regard to their sequence, they change within the Bible, early treaties versus late treaties, and as they do so, they are mirroring sequence of treaty elements attested from extra-biblical materials. Perhaps you're already seeing where this is going. The question then would be raised, if the patriarchal materials were first composed very late, perhaps in the 5th or 6th century BC, how would they have known to report details such as treaty component sequence or slave prices with the degree of accuracy that we're finding in the biblical material? How would they have known to change the sequence of presentation of treaty materials, treaty components? The next several bullets we'll cover just summarily with this single slide. Geopolitical, then, is our third item. We've already covered slave price and treaty covenants. Geopolitical conditions. The basic concept here is as follows. In the ancient Near East, there were periods of time when large regions were controlled by dominating empires. And then, periodically, those empires would weaken in their control, and small fiefdoms or kingdoms, city-states, were able to emerge and exercise local control, a sense of autonomy. So either you had a big empire or you had little kingdoms. Those are your two general options, roughly speaking. Here's what's interesting. Genesis 14 records a time when several little kings gathered together, formed an alliance, and attacked Sodom and Gomorrah. That was the time when Lot, nephew of Abraham, is captured, and Abraham mounts a rescue effort, sends some troops and goes with them to rescue his nephew, along with the other citizens from those city-states, cities that had been captive. Now, if you reflect on what we just summarized between the two historical options of empires and small regions, small kingdoms, you can see that for Genesis 14 to have validity, it must have happened during one of those periods when small kingdoms could form an alliance. For you see, otherwise the large empires would so suppress those small kingdoms that the sort of thing we see in Genesis 14 would have never happened. They would have been afraid of marshaling military might, lest the big empire under whose thumb they are existing would suddenly get concerned about it and squash them. So that kind of a coalition and launching a military expedition could only happen during a time when there is empire weakness. We notice that there's a period in ancient Near East history between 2000 and 1750 when that very thing could have happened. In other words, there was a waning, a weakening of empire strength, an opportunity for these little fellows to poke their heads up and be strong and exercise some autonomy and coalition and military expedition. The events of Genesis 14, they fit well in that period. The biblical material, as we reach back and estimate roughly when was Abraham operating, somewhere around 1800 BC, that event corresponds well to what we know extra-biblically to have been possible. The next bullet has to do with mention of Egypt in the Hebrew Bible, particularly the mention of capitals, capital cities. As we encounter reference to Egypt within the book of Genesis, it seems evident that people are able to get in touch with the Pharaoh within the region of the Delta, so northern Egypt, downstream Egypt. Now, lest you think that that was always the case, it was not. There were periods of time in Egyptian history when the capital, where you'd most easily encounter the Pharaoh, was further upstream, further south. So, in summary, the picture presented by Genesis accounts interaction with Pharaoh, locate him in the general Delta region, and that fits what we know about where the Egyptian capital was in the time frame of 20th to the 16th centuries. So that fits. The next item is a bit more specialized, patriarchal names. And it has to do with the sound of the names, some of the names that we find in Genesis, namely Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. It's disguised a bit coming into English, but if you hear them in Hebrew, you can see that there's an I or Y prefix for each one. Here's what they sound like. Isaac is Yitzhak, Yitzhak. Jacob is Yaakov, Yaakov. You're hearing the Y in the front? Joseph, Yosef, Yosef. Again, a Y in the front. It's been observed that in the early 2nd millennium BC, this formation of a name has been attested in the Mari archives. Please understand, we're not saying there's extra biblical evidence for these particular figures, these historic figures from the Hebrew Bible, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. We're just saying there were times when that sort of a name was very natural, was normal, and then there were times when it was not so natural or normal. The time frame when Isaac and Jacob and Joseph were purported to have been living, well, that fits with what we know from Mari concerning the normal period for names of that sort. The next bullet point, entitled The Social World of the Patriarchs, How Did the Society Function?, concentrates in particularly on laws of inheritance. There were eras when the eldest son would have inherited a double portion in comparison to other siblings, and that when that's indicated for the biblical account, it parallels well the era when we know that was the case outside the Bible, namely the Middle Bronze era. There were other times when that social custom did not obtain, but we find a consonance, a matchup between when that is attested in Scripture, when it's mentioned in Scripture, and when it's attested outside the Bible. Ancient narratives is the last point, and here's what we can benefit from in this regard. On the left, you'll see that in literature of the ancient Near East, there was a development of style that changed over time. Some of the earlier materials we find are autobiographical, also biographical, and they seem to concentrate on what an individual was doing. That changed later on. It gave way to the development of historical legends, and even later on to fictional tales, an example of which would be the Egyptian document called Tales of the Magician, found in the Westcar Papyrus. When we look to the patriarchal accounts, again, we're not making a survey of the entire Hebrew Bible, we're just concentrating on the patriarchal era. When we look to the patriarchal accounts, we find that the sort of material, the sort of stories that are related here most closely resemble that first bullet on the left, namely autobiographical or biographical. And focusing on individuals, not focusing so much on large nations or legends or tales, but telling the story of particular individuals. So that matches for the early literature. What this means is that if Genesis were written much later, say in the 5th or 6th century BC, their tendency would have been to have written in a style of their era, their contemporaries, which would have been historical legends or fictional tales. But instead, the Genesis material is written in a style that corresponds to early literature of the ancient Near East. Kitchen concludes with this statement: given that other Near Eastern peoples preserved accurate information, even over as long as 1,000 years, there is no a priori reason why the early Hebrews should not have been able to do the same sort of thing. Notice the viewpoint that this specialist in Egyptology is adopting. He's saying, if when we move over to extra-biblical accounts, we are willing to trust that some of that data may be accurately reflecting, accurately reporting historic information that was much, much older than the account that we hold, even 1,000 years prior, then there should be no presupposition that that can't happen with biblical material. We should give it an even chance to be trusted to the extent that extra-biblical material is trusted by the secular historian, archaeologist, and specialist in ancient literature. Play with an even playing field. Too often, the case has been made, or the assumption has been made, rather, that for some reason biblical material is less trustworthy than extra-biblical literature. But you can see for these various points, the price of slaves, sequence of elements in treaties and covenants, geopolitical conditions, that is, empire versus small kingdom, references to Egypt with regard to the location of its capital, the formation of names, patriarchal names, and then inheritance patterns, and finally the literary style of ancient narratives. All these attest that the patriarchal material in the Hebrew Bible has a high degree of consonance with corresponding elements in extra-biblical record, and consequently merits trust.